What's going on, guys, and welcome to today's video. And today we are going to be swapping the shock shafts on the TRAXXAS Jato for the spec Jato class. Now, why are we swapping shock shafts? Apparently, the stock shock shafts are made out of wet noodles. Apparently, any sort of impact here to the front of the vehicle, whether that be another car, barrier, what have you, they get bent real easy. So one of the allowable modifications changes is the optional titanium nitrate coated shock shafts. These are a harder metal or harder coated metal that are apparently a lot less prone to bending. So, you know, instead of ruining your race day with a bent shock shaft, you can at least get these things thrown in day one and hopefully have a smoother race day, practice day, qualifying there in the class. So we've got the TRAXXAS 7465T, and that is a 2-pack of the extra long GTR shock shafts, and that is required for the TRAXXAS Jato. I bought 2 sets of these for front and rear. The rear is not as important, but might as well do it while we're here. So I'm going to show you guys swapping shock shafts. This is kind of a shock rebuild, but we aren't really replacing any seals or anything like that because these are brand new and this thing has never even had power put to it, so it's never been driven. So all of our seals are going to be in good shape. So that process here on these newer GTR shocks is pretty simple. We're going to be pulling out the 2mm screw here at the bottom. That actually holds that lower shock, or excuse me, holds the lower spring retainer in place. That's really cool that these have that captured or bolt-on spring retainer, so you don't have a spring retainer come off again in a bad accident, lose it, and then you're right back to square one having a bad day on track. So with that 2mm out, we can pull our lower spring retainer off, we can get our spring pulled off, and now we are ready to start disassembling the shock. Again, you will need those shock shafts. You'll also need some fluid here. I'm just going back with the factory fluid for the Jato, which is 40 weight in the front, 50 weight in the rear. So I grabbed some 40 weight, some 50 weight, and again, those shock shafts, and that's kind of it. One thing that is kind of nice to have, but not really necessary, a set of shock shaft pliers. These are a set of ProTech pliers. And they do make it a little bit nicer so you can grip that shock shaft without marring up the finish, and then you're in turn damaging the shock O-rings and seals there on the bottom. So you might think about a set of these if you're going to be doing shock maintenance, shock rebuilds here on anything for that matter. So with our spring lower retainer pulled off, we can go ahead and pull the lower mount off. And again, these shock shaft pliers are pretty darn cool. You can get them in the proper groove and you can really get a good firm hold on that shock shaft and not have to grab it with a pair of pliers, mar up the finish, and again, cause issues. So TRAXXAS actually has a super nice shock tool that comes with most of the models. You've got a position on this thing for the top shock mount, the lower shock cap, the lower rod end here. I mean, it's a really darn good tool. It fits really well and works really nicely. So again, with that TRAXXAS tool, we're going to thread off our lower shock mount here. Now with the lower off, we are ready to pull the upper mount. Now keep in mind, this thing is full of oil, so don't be, you know, prepare your surface before you start tearing this thing apart. Again, with that TRAXXAS shock tool, we can grip the shock body and loosen this thing up. Now keep in mind, these shocks, at least on the BL-2s, are a plastic body shock, so don't get too crazy when you're loosening, tightening, whatever. Keep in mind, the threads are plastic. You could crack, break, whatever, since these are not aluminum body GTR shocks. But with that upper cap loose, We can go ahead and finish threading that thing off by hand. Keep in mind where the upper shock seal diaphragm, whatever you want to call it, is. Make sure it is nicely there in the cap, and we can set that to the side. Now, one thing to take a look at is where the shock fluid level is. Now, you could have old shocks that have leaked all the fluid out, so at that point, that's irrelevant. But the new shocks, we've got the fluid level here just a few millimeters away from the top of the shock body. So we will kind of keep that in mind as we are refilling these things to kind of fill right there at that level. With the upper cap off, we're going to want to have some sort of, plastic bottle, whatever, where we can dump the old shock oil out. Because again, we're going to need to push the piston with the shock shaft out of this thing. So I've just got a little plastic bottle here that we are dumping the fluid into. So with that fluid out, we are ready to kind of push our shock shaft up out of the shock body. And then we can grab that piston, get our shock body set to the side. Now we are going to need to at least in this case, we've got a little teeny nut here on the top of that shock shaft. A lot of shocks are going to have little E-clip, C-clips there at the top that you're going to need to battle with. These, luckily or unluckily, do have a nut here at the top. So we are going to be able to kind of wipe off our extra shock oil here. And again, we'll use our shock shaft pliers. And again, another provided tool here, the old classic, X cross wrench, whatever you want to call it. One of these is the proper size for that upper shock shaft nut. We'll go ahead and thread that nut off. Now, again, you're going to need to pay attention to what you're working on. In this case, we've got a plastic shock piston, and then we have a teeny little washer, little metal washer underneath there on the shock shaft. So as we are swapping those over to our new, we are going to need to make sure we get, obviously, that washer moved over with the shock piston, and then we'll be able to get the nut put back on. So now we've got our new titanium nitride coated shock shafts here, and we will very easily swap our, again, piston and the metal washer. It's stuck on the back of the piston, and we will get that swapped over. Set our standard shock shaft to the side, and then we can grab the shock shaft nut, grab a hold of our shock shaft, and tighten this thing down. Or again, if yours is a E-clip, C-clip style, you'll be putting those back in and probably shooting them across the room like they normally do. So we will get this tightened down. And now we're going to be ready to slide this shock shaft back into the shock body. Now, keep in mind, at the bottom of the shock body, we've got multiple O-rings, X-rings, seals, depending on your style or brand of shock. One thing that I like to do is grab just a little bit of fresh shock oil and give the kind of lower section of that shock shaft just a little bit of oil there, just so we are having a little bit more lubrication to be able to pass the threaded area there through those O-rings. So we will start to set that back into place. And one thing you may need to do is loosen or take off the lower shock cap. My piston isn't really wanting to push any further in because of those O-rings. So we'll just quickly hold the shock body. Again, another position on that TRAXXAS wrench. Go ahead and loosen that lower cap. And with it loose, we're able then to get the shock shaft to pass through this thing. We can go ahead, tighten that lower cap back down. And now at this point, we are ready to fill the shock. You're going to want some sort of thing to put the shock on in an upright position. A lot of vehicle pit stands do have shock building holes there in it, but you don't even need that. Just a literal cardboard box, a small cardboard box with a couple of holes punched in it will do the exact same and is absolutely free. So again, you don't need a fancy stand. A cardboard box will work just as well. So with our shock again in place, one thing I kind of like to do is move our piston up about a third of the way up the shock body before I start filling. Now, why we do that, we start to fill this thing with fluid, and we are going to, maybe fill it halfway full with fluid. Now, the point of only filling halfway and moving our shock shaft up a little bit is we've got a whole bunch of air now underneath the piston. So we are going to be able to pull our shock shaft down, which pushes all of the air up into the fluid. Now, why we only have it half full is those air bubbles now only need to travel about halfway the length of the shock body to get out and into the air. If you had this thing filled all the way full, it would take even longer for those bubbles to travel through that heavyweight shock oil. So like I said, we've got that shock shaft pulled all the way down. You can kind of keep an eye on it here and move it up and down and make sure you don't have any large bubbles still pushing out through the piston holes there on the shock piston. And again, you guys aren't going to be able to see in this shock, but again, I'm moving that piston up and down and we don't have any large bubbles. We've got some little teeny bubbles there that are left. So at this point, I'll go ahead and fill this shock the rest of the way up. Again, leaving that little 2 millimeter or so gap between the fluid and the top of the shock body. Now, again, it's kind of a good practice to keep an eye or look down that shock and kind of run that piston up and down. Be mindful to not push fluid out of the top, but again, make sure you don't have any hidden bubbles there underneath that shock piston. So we have no large bubbles left, but we do have some of those teeny little microscopic bubbles. One thing you can do is just let this thing sit, let it chill for a little bit, and those bubbles, some of those bubbles will work their way up and finally out of the fluid. After you give it some time, you're happy with what you see, as long as we're seeing pretty much, 100% shock fluid in there. We don't have it all aerated and full of bubbles. We are going to be ready to throw our shock cap back on. Again, if your shocks are tired, old, leaky, you might want to change this upper seal diaphragm. If your shocks are new like these, you're going to be able to make sure that thing is in place and go ahead and set our upper cap back on. Thread that thing down, and again, grab our factory upper shock tool here and make sure we are, again, bottomed out, keeping in mind this is a plastic body shock, plastic cap. You can damage things if you tighten them too aggressively. We'll wipe any excess extra shock oil that we might have ran out during that process. And now at this point, I am going to throw my lower shock mount back on. So again, we'll pull out those shock shaft pliers, grab onto our new shaft, and we can again get the lower shock mount threaded on this thing. All right, so we now have our shock shaft installed. We've got fluid in this thing. One thing that is good is to kind of put this thing up to your ear and cycle the shock a few times. What we're listening for is any sort of aeration, any sort of air pockets. You're kind of, listening and feeling at the same time. And this thing sounds very smooth all the way through the travel. Now, before I throw shocks back on, before I throw springs back on, I like to do a little shock dyno, if you will. I at least like to make sure both of the shocks are rebounding similarly. Again, if you've got too much fluid or too little fluid in one, you're going to have very different amounts of rebound, or the shock shaft's not going to push back out as far. So always a good thing if you're doing both. Go ahead and take both shocks, push them down, and let them up, and see how much shock shaft comes out. So guys, as you can see, we do have a little bit of difference here. We've got our left shock shaft pushing out slightly less than our right. So if we wanted to dial this in even further, we could potentially add a little bit of fluid in this shock to help increase that fluid pressure as it's pushing up on that upper diaphragm. But this is pretty darn similar in a very non-high performance vehicle here. So this is going to do us just fine. Now, last but not least, we will get our spring thrown back on. We've got our lower spring retainer that, again, in this case is held on with those nice 2mm screws to keep them in place when bad things happen on track. And guys, just like that, we've got a rebuilt shock, or at least in this case, a new shock, shafted shock here, full of fluid. And again, another good thing to check before you throw this thing back on, whether that be a pair of fronts or a pair of rears, make sure your shock preload adjusters are in the same spot. Now, do we need micrometers out here measuring to make sure? You could if you wanted to, but even just looking by eye, we can make sure the distance between that upper shock cap and the threaded shock body adjuster is in the same spot. You know, if one was all the way up and the other one was down, again, we're going to have different preload on each side of the vehicle. So making sure preload adjusters are where they're at, we are going to be able to throw these shocks back on the vehicle and hopefully have a little bit less worry out on the track, whether we are, again, in this case, throwing fresh titanium nitrate shock shafts on, or if, again, you're just doing a maintenance rebuild refresh of fluid, you'll hopefully be a little more ready for the track. So guys, I think that's going to do it for today's video. I've got to get these shocks thrown back on and hopefully get this thing on track and see how it actually does. So guys, thanks for coming out for another spec Jato video here, getting this thing prepped up for some track time. And guys, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.